Hello, my name is Dave Rogers, and welcome to my studio. You know, one of my favorite things to paint is the texture of old wood or rusty metal, and today I'm going to walk you through some of the techniques that I like to use to do that. We'll look at how to use dry brush, layering, and maybe even a few happy accidents to see if we can get that beautiful aged texture look. This demonstration comes from the Weathered Country Barn Watercolor Mastery Workshop, and you can find a link to that full video in the description below. Let's get started. So what's interesting about this technique for both wood and for painting rust is they both use a dry brush technique, and what we're really using here is the belly of the brush. And as you can see, I have just a regular round, I believe this is a number 10 round brush, and we're going to start with some burnt umber, and we'll start with the wood technique. Now the wood technique really, again, it's just a dry brush technique, and I'm using my brush in a palm down fashion. And the idea here, in order to get the best result, what you want to do is you want to go, your brush stroke should follow the grain of the wood, or what you want the grain of the wood to be. Now, the way that the dry brush technique works is what you're really using here to create this effect is the texture of the paper. And what I'll do now is I'll show you this similar technique that I would use for painting rust. And I'm using exactly the same belly of the brush technique, but I'm using a different stroke. As you can see, I'm still using the texture of the paper, but I'm using more of what might be called a scumbling technique. So unlike the technique for wood, the brush strokes are not really directional as much as they are intentionally broken on the edges, just to give that really random rust look to this first wash of color. So very similar techniques in that we're using the texture of the paper, but very different in their application. So now I'm going to show you that first technique that we used for wood to actually create a little painting here that actually looks like wood. And as you can see, we've got a little inset on the lower right-hand side for me to kind of use as a reference. Now this particular painting demonstration is not going to be exactly like that, but it'll be very similar in that it'll still have some cracks of wood, and it'll still have that same wood look to it. But I want to show you basically what the process is. Now, just like with any watercolor painting, what I want to do here is I want to reach for, or I want to think about, what is the lightest value within that shape? What is the lightest value of color? And what I can see is really this very faint, almost like a yellow ochre / burnt umber color. And what I like to do whenever I'm painting wood, what I like to start with or begin with is a base color to really put this dry brush effect on. Now you can see I'm still using the side of the brush here to create this first wash, and I am getting a few broken brush strokes. And all of the strokes, all of the brush strokes that I'm making here, you can see they all follow the direction of the grain of the wood. Even in this first wash, they all still follow that same direction. So that we've got these, anywhere where we've got that texture, we also have a broken edge that is following that same pattern. So here we're just going to dry this out, and the reason that we want this dry is because all of the subsequent washes that go over the top of this base color are going to be those wet on dry brush marks that I showed you in the first part of the demonstration. So now we have a dry painting, and I'm going to reach for a little bit more of that burnt umber / burnt sienna. By the way, our color palette here is yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and burnt umber together with a little bit of indigo to darken things up when the time comes. But what we want to try to do here is we want to try to stick to 3 basic values. Now when I say values, what I'm talking about is the darkness or the lightness of a color. Now value 1 is that initial wash of color that we put down first, and this is value number 2. And value 2 is you could consider value 2 to be almost like a mid-tone. So value 2, you can see we're still following the grain of the wood with all of our brush strokes, and we're really beginning to go for that broken edge look, that dry brush effect that really makes this texture really stand out. So I've got that second wash of color, and now what I'm going to do, now what you see me doing is I'm actually mixing up a little bit darker pigment, and I'm just dropping that darker pigment with brush strokes, again, always following the texture of the wood. Just dropping in those darker brush strokes and letting them blend into those dry brush marks that I made in the previous step. And you can see some of these brush strokes are going to be fairly dark. Now, keep in mind when watercolor paint dries, it dries roughly 3 value shades lighter than it was when you put it down. So you can really, what I like to do is I like to kind of opt for something that I feel like might be a little bit darker than what I think it should be, because by the time it dries, it's probably going to dry to be about the right value. So here you see I'm just dropping in some more of those darker brush strokes. And what I'm going for here is variation. I want a lot of variation in that value and something that really looks like the texture of wood. Now, although these brush strokes are a little darker than the original dry brush stroke that I put down, I would still consider all of this to be within that number 2 value category. We're gonna go one shade darker than the number 2 value. We're actually gonna go to the number 3 value with a lot of the details in the wood, a lot of the cracks and the knot in the wood and all of that. But right now we're still working within the number 2 value. And once we have that number 2 value down, now we're going to blow dry the painting one more time, get it nice and dry, and then we're going to move on to to the darker step. You'll notice that each step, also what we want to do before we move on to the next step is after each application, we want to dry out the painting completely, because this is a wet on dry process. This is not a wet and wet process. It's a wet on dry process. And that's what's going to give you all of that texture that we're looking for. And it's what's going to give it that wood look. So we have a number 1 value, we have a number 2 value with variation, and now we are going to add our number 3 value. Now if you look at the inset, the darkest areas within that within that example of wood that we have in the picture, all of that is what we want to add next. All of the cracks, the knot in the wood, those are all the details that are going to give this piece of wood its character. So we're going to mix up some more color. Now what I'm doing here now is I'm adding a little bit, just a touch of indigo to my burnt umber mixture. And what that's going to do, it's going to give me that number 3 value that I was talking about. Now what you'll see me doing here is, again, following the grain of the wood, following the shape that we've already established with all of that dry brush work. We're just going to emphasize now some of these cracks that are in the that are going to be in the wood. Now I'm not following exactly what the image is, but what I am trying to do is I'm trying to paint something similar that looks like wood or has the appearance of wood. So I've got the cracks, and now what I'm going to paint or attempt to paint is the knot up here at the top. Now the knot hole really is just basically just a series of circular strokes, and what I like to do is to put the brush strokes down like you see me doing here, and then kind of soften some of the edges, and it just kind of gives it just a little bit more believability. And then what I'll do is I'll actually add these directional cracks that kind of lead up to that shape. And as they get to that shape, either they stop or they bend right at that right at the knot in the wood there. And you'll see me kind of randomly adding these cracks that kind of lead up to that shape on both sides. And yeah, I think it's pretty convincing. Very similar to the photograph down below. And there we have our weathered wood in watercolor. And what I'd like to do for you now is to do another demonstration on how to paint rust, just like we did in the beginning of the video, but with a little bit more detail, just like we have here. So this is going to be our rust demonstration, and just like we had before, we have an inset on the bottom right that gives us an idea of what the rust will look like. We're using the same exact brush, and we're going to use basically, like I said, the same method. We're starting out with the lightest value. So instead of the directional brush strokes that we had before, though, with the wood, now what we have are these just like this random scumbling effect, but it's still a dry brush technique. It's still that we're still using the texture of the paper. We're still being very random with our edges, and we're switching up our color to burnt sienna as opposed to mostly burnt umber, and that's going to give us our rust look. What you see me doing here is I'm actually dropping in just a little bit more color into that shape. What's really neat about this effect, about this technique, is that once you've established that edge with the dry brush technique, you can drop in more pigment and make it darker, and it really just, what happens is the pigment just kind of flows into that shape that you've created and into those edges. So very, very useful, especially for painting rust like this. So I'm just working my way around the shape and making sure that I have some very random edges all the way around, making sure that it has a very organic look. And I feel like there might be a little bit of separation in the shape. Might be good to have some smaller rust shapes on the top and on the bottom. So I'm just adding a little bit there. Now what you see me doing is I'm actually mixing up that number 2 value, just like we had with the wood. I'm going to add that number 2 value right into these brush strokes. And what I'm going for here is I want to have a dominant dark area. Most of the rust that you see, it's really kind of patchy. And in fact, just if you take a look at the inset that you have there on the lower right, you see you've got areas that are dark, areas that are light. And that's what I'm doing here. And again, I'm using those established edges and just allowing that pigment to flow right into those edges. And as you can see, we've sped things up a bit and allowed that to dry. Now what I'll do is I'll come in with my number 3 value, and that's what you see me mixing up here, using the same exact technique, that same scumbling technique that we used before, because now we're going back to wet on dry again. And now we're going to reestablish some of those rough edges within this shape, just like just like you see in the inset. If we can get to that number 3 value, we're really going to have a convincing effect. And that's what we're going to attempt to do here, is really to darken things up, really try to get into those deep, dark number 3 values that we see in our example. So I'm just, again, just working my way around the shape, keeping in mind too that I still want that dominant, darkest area to kind of stand on its own within that shape. And almost like that rust is radiating from one place and getting thinner as it gets out closer to the edges. So I'm just going to take a little bit more of that pigment and just really try to darken up that right in the center of that shape. And I think it will really add to that illusion of this rust just kind of flowing from the center and radiating from one place out to the edges. And at the edges, you can see that it kind of dissipates. And I think it's fairly convincing. So we'll just allow that to dry. We're going to speed things up a bit here. And now what we're going to do one final step for this. And really what I'm going for now is I really want to add a lot of that spotty texture that you see, especially in the inset, where you've got, it almost looks like drips of paint. Well, that's how we're going to create it anyways. We're actually going to use drips of paint to create this textured effect within this shape. So I'm just going to load up my brush with some of that same color, and I'm just going to use a tapping technique just to allow some of these drips and some of these splatters to cover this same shape. And what I want to do here is I want to try to concentrate my efforts in one area, and kind of like you see in the inset there, where you see in the upper left hand side where you've got some really dark areas of those splatters. If we do this effectively, we can actually create something that looks very, very similar to that. So we're just going to really try to concentrate on that upper left hand corner, just like we see in the inset, and hopefully come up with a result that is fairly similar. Right. And I think that could work as rust. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. So that's a sneak peek into some of the techniques that I would use to paint weathered wood or rusty metal. If you'd like for me to show you how to paint this full scene step by step, this is just part of the Weathered Country Barn Watercolor Mastery Workshop, and you can find a link to the full video down below in the description. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and if you liked that video, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe button for more watercolor tips and demonstrations. I'll see you next time.